Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Lena Andrews and her book Valiant Women about all of the women who joined the military in World War II in the U.S. Love this book, love talking to Lena. And listen, she works for the CIA, and as far as I know, I'm not on any more watch lists than I was before the interview. So, victory right there, people. I'm not going to belabor the point. Let's bring Lena on. And here we are with author Lena Andrews, Valiant Women, the extraordinary American service women who helped win World War II. Lena, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so before we get to the book, you work at the CIA, correct?
Yes, I do. Yes.
All right, so I have a couple follow-up questions. Number one, who really killed JFK? Where are you hiding the aliens? And am I now on a list for even asking about these things?
Well, Brendan, I'm sure you're on a list, but I'm not sure it's for asking about these things.
Fair. Very fair.
But no, no comment. No comment. That's my refrain when it comes to my work, unfortunately.
Hey, for the listeners, I know you can't see her, but she winked when she said that. So I'll get the details and I'll come back to you guys. All right, so let's jump to this book. I really love this book. I mean, you're covering just really, I think in our head, we think World War II, we think women, we think Rosie the Riveter. What made you decide that you needed to write Valiant Women? Where'd you get the idea from?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Rosie, because if you asked me this question 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would have said, yeah, I know the whole story about women in World War II. It's Rosie the Riveter in manufacturing. You may have read about the spies or the code breakers who were doing really cool stuff behind the front lines. And I sort of knew that intellectually, and in my work, I did my entire dissertation on World War II. So I was more on the operational side of the equation, but I counted myself as an expert in World War II. And I thought that was the whole story about women, that, they were in manufacturing, they were doing these niche sort of things. But it actually was a totally serendipitous visit to the Military Women's Memorial, which is, if your listeners haven't been, is a great memorial in the National Mall. It's right at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. And I was there, I think we were visiting Arlington, and it was an offshoot of the trip. And I stumbled onto this fantastic World War II exhibit. And I, a proclaimed expert on World War II, and many of my colleagues who were there, who are also proclaimed experts on World War II, were confronted with the reality, which is that the scale and the scope and the magnitude of what women, particularly in uniform, were contributing was just enormous. It was way beyond what I had thought. And it was at the heart of Allied operations, and particularly support operations that most people don't know about, are a little underappreciated, but are essential on the battlefield. And so then it got into my head, and, like any good researcher, when you find out something you don't know, you sort of are embarrassed for a minute, and then you get really motivated. And for me, that's exactly what happened. I had basically went home, I ordered every book I could, every memoir I could, and I just couldn't get it on my head. And the result, a couple of years later is Valiant Women.
I mean, this is exactly how a history nerd thinks. This is why we're already friends, Lena. You don't know it yet, but we're already friends.
We're there.
Well, especially as an author, there's a technical question I want to talk to you about, because this isn't just a couple of women. Like, you have a lot of characters in this. And I read a lot of books. Some will say too many books. But it's usually very easier for an author if you pick 2 or 3 people and you bring them through. You upped your difficulty of writing this by adding in all of these characters. What made you decide to do it that way? Were you a bit nervous that there were so many and trying to juggle them?
I'm so glad you said it, because I hope that a lot of readers don't feel like they've been sold a bill of goods or something here. I'm not trying to tell 1 or 2 stories well. That has been done elsewhere, and I've got many good recommendations about, books about Virginia Hall and books about all these incredible women who we love. But what was really important to me was, as you said, to really cover the scope of what everyone was doing. And that means that there are, I think, something like 30 veteran stories intermixed throughout the book. And yeah, it was terrifying to think about juggling all those stories. But in one way, it was terrifying. In another way, it was really exciting, because for me, that is the key underlying point for readers, is that it's not just one thing that makes that wins a war or fights a battle. It's the contributions of hundreds of thousands of people, including women, who really all need to be literally marching to the beat of the same drummer. And in this case, it was, when I started to sit down and write it, it really felt like it hung together in a way. Even though there were so many stories, they sort of seamlessly wove into each other. So I hope that comes through. And I'll tell you, I'll confess, there are probably another 30 that are on the cutting room floor that I'm trying to find placements for original pieces so I can get them back into the story, and I'll, if we, maybe later I'll use some of their stories, because there's so many amazing anecdotes from these women.
This is why editors is so important, right? Because this could have been 1,000 pages, right?
Absolutely. My poor editor, he was a saint, and thank God he existed, because it would have just gone on and on.
So now, what is the turning point, right? We said Rosie the Riveter. I think people can put that in their heads. The men are off to war. The women got to go to the factories. What's the turning point where the military looks and says, we need women too?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a kind of complicated question, in the sense that for different parts of the government and even in the military, it sort of evolves in a slightly different way. Many Americans, even many of the people who know World War II, sort of think that it begins with Pearl Harbor, which, of those of us who are, the true, honest to goodness World War II nerds know, of course, that World War II has been going on for years before Pearl Harbor happens. And no one is watching it more closely than General George C. Marshall, who is one of my favorite generals for many reasons, but especially because he's obsessed with these weird nitty gritty details that are essential to combat operations, but nobody else really is fixated on. And one of them is manpower. So as early as 1938, 1939, he is very consumed by the issue of people. Are we going to have enough people? How are we going to get enough people? How are we going to convince the American public, after fighting World War I and losing all these men in Europe, that we should then do it again, 20 years later? So he is totally fixated on this very early on in the war. Roosevelt also equally understands the problem of manpower. Neither of them are willing to consider women that early. I will tell you that. It takes until about 1942 to get them convinced of the need for women in particular. But they are consumed with the issue of they know they're going to have to get creative solutions. The American public, on the other hand, is basically ignoring this war as much as they possibly can, until Pearl Harbor comes around and sort of forces a reckoning of, this is not something that we can keep outside of our shores anymore, very obviously. I do think, for the senior leaders, the idea of needing to be creative about manpower occurs very early on, but the actual reality of women is not something that happens until a couple of years into the war, when they are truly, when we have our backs against the wall and it's clear that there's nowhere left to turn. There are not enough men, and we have to get creative about how we're going to solve this massive manpower problem.
And that's a big thing too that people don't realize, and you really highlight here, is we're not talking about, we're short about 10,000 personnel. Let's see. It's a gigantic gap that all of these planners are saying, this is what we need just to keep going. Because it's not just combat fighters. You're talking about all the support staff too. It's not a small gap they're trying to fill. It's a ginormous crater, right?
Absolutely. And so, just to give people a sense who aren't in the nitty gritty of it, at the start of 1939 or so, we have 200,000 people serving in the Army. By the end of World War II, we will have 16 million people in uniform. So filling that gap is enormous. And in addition to just the military problem of having enough people in uniform, there's also this huge manufacturing industry. And at the time, the military is competing with the manufacturing industry for this very small subset of the American public, which, grows later, becomes a bigger group, but starts out as being basically white men between 20 and 45. That's the primary demographic that both places want. In the book, I break down essentially that the math doesn't really add up, and that we're talking about a large population, of course, but when you're competing over a very narrow segment of it, it gets really difficult really fast to find the right personnel, not just for the war, but also for manufacturing and then everything in between, right? Because it doesn't help you to have a plane sitting in Georgia if you need it in the Pacific. And so those major pulls on the military and those competitions that the military is engaging in make it really a very challenging environment for personnel, of which, Marshall and all of the commanders are very, very well aware by the early 1940s.
Well, of course, then what happened is everyone went to the American public and said, here's the math. And everybody's like, cool, we totally understand and we're fine with it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. The American public, who in his memoirs, Marshall is sort of very, not disparaging toward, but very realistic about their belief that, and I think to this day, this is actually a reality that I hope that people reckon with when they read the book, is that people think that when the war begins, if a war begins, the military just sort of arrives fully formed and ready to go. And certainly at the turn of the century and even now, that's not how it works. Militaries even the best militaries take time to build, particularly to train men and personnel and women. And so it was a bumpy road. It really wasn't until Pearl Harbor. And even then, Marshall had to explain, you haven't given me the tools to build the military that you're asking for now. And despite the fact that I've been warning you about it for years at this point. So it was definitely a bumpy process, but thank goodness we had people like Marshall, like Roosevelt, like King, all these commanders who sort of knew how to make the military case for expanding very quickly, and had done, quite frankly, a lot of the legwork that they needed to do very quietly and out of view of the American public.
I can personally verify that I was in the Army for 5 years, and even at the end of those 5 years, I was still an idiot. Neither here nor there.
But you were trained.
Yes. Which branch of service kind of breaks the dam? Which one jumps in feet first and says, we've got to do this even if we're going to catch flack for it?
Yeah. So unsurprisingly, it's the Army. There are a couple reasons for this. One is Marshall is a visionary. He gets it. He's also forced to do it by an incredible personality, by a woman named Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers. And she is dynamo. She's one of the few women in Congress at this time, and she's a major advocate for veterans and women's issues. And she essentially says to Marshall, you're going to need women. I know this. I've known this for years. I'm going to introduce a bill and force you to do it, or you can work with me and we can find a solution that is, amenable to both of us. And the military, as it often is, doesn't like to be told what to do, but if it is going to be told what to do, likes to have some say in it. And Marshall sort of says, give me a month and then give me a couple more months, and he comes up with his own plan. Now, I will say that the Navy is watching this very closely. They are also responsible to Congress, and they're also seeing what Congresswoman Rogers is doing. And so they start spinning up a little bit more slowly, but certainly, pretty soon after the Army, just because they understand that she's coming for them too. And she does. It turns out months later, she uses the Army as the precedent that allows her to get some leverage with the Navy, who then comes along and integrates women a couple months after that.
And then, of course, a lot of people, if you're not a history and you don't know this, the Air Force that we know, the Air Force is actually part of the Army right now. But it's all, even at this point, it's still kind of its own thing, right, too? Because I always key in on that one, because that's when you talk about women taking step forwards, especially when it comes to occupations. This is one of the chances where women can really start flying some planes, right?
Yeah, and I love the story of the U.S. Air Force. In fact, my entire dissertation before I did women was on basically the U.S. Air Force in World War II, which at that time, as you rightly note, is the U.S. Army Air Forces. And so there are two elements of the sort of women's population that they're drawing on. First is that because they're part of the Army, they end up being one of the most sort of voracious requesters of women, because they themselves are in a moment of incredible change and incredible growth. And, most folks probably don't remember this, but planes as a tool of combat are really making their true debut in World War II. Of course, they've been used in World War I, but in World War II, it's more meaningful. And so they're kind of the innovators and the, black sheep of the Army already. And so when women come along, they say, oh, this is great. Come on in. We're all a little bit crazy here. And so they have a lot of Army women who sign up, but they also have this small cadre of what's called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And it's led by an incredible flyer and pilot named Jackie Corcoran. And these are the best women pilots in the country, of which there are, turns out, many. About 1,000 women will ultimately serve as pilots in the United States in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And what they're doing is moving planes around to different bases to ensure that they're at the right place at the right time. They're doing training exercises with, live artillery shells. They're doing sort of all the stuff that there aren't enough male pilots to do, because all those male pilots are in Europe and the Pacific fighting the Germans and the Japanese. Some of my favorite stories are of the WASP, even though they're this really small cadre. People forget how dangerous it was to fly these planes in 1943 or whatever, but they have the best stories. They're crash landing and, escaping fiery wrecks and dealing with the fact that they, have to go to the bathroom at 10,000 feet. What do you do? Like, these are all these great stories. They all come from these incredible WASPs, who also have the best nickname of the group, the WASPs. So I love their stories, and they're featured pretty prominently throughout the book.
Now, of course, there's just a lot of politics around this. I'm sure there's a lot of men who are just not comfortable with this. But luckily, all of the women are on the same page, right? Women supporting women 100% across the board.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'll put it this way. In writing this book, I was someone who came into I thought I was a person who had a really deep, rich understanding of the 20th century women's movement and the sort of diverse swirl of views about how women's progress would unfolded during that period. I came out of it feeling more confused than ever, because I think in some ways this generation, the greatest generation, is the perfect epitome of just the spectrum of views that exist. So at the top, I think most of the women who were in charge of the programs were aligned on the view that this should be a volunteer corps of really ladylike, really poised, really smart, really talented women who are doing an excellent job. And in principle, that would have been great. In practice, there are 350,000 American women who serve in uniform. And if you take a cross-section that large of the American population, you're going to get a lot of different types of people. And I should add that a lot of the controversies that existed within the women's units were around race, were around sexuality, or around all of these sort of hot button issues that even today, I think, resonate. So many women of color, thousands of women of color served in uniform. They in the Army were in segregated units. That was a major controversy. There was, of course, controversies over things as simple as like uniforms, whether or not women would wear pants and skirts and all this stuff. So it really covered the waterfront, but it was certainly not an easy ride for the women themselves. And I do sympathize to a certain extent with the leaders who had to manage all of these very different women cut from different cloths who were all trying to serve, but, were approaching it in very different ways.
Now, there's a lot of reasons to get pretty annoyed with people in this book, but there's one reason that really just pissed me off. As a veteran who has had to avail himself of certain benefits, the women, when they sign up, it takes a while before they're seen as part of these military outfits, whatever they are. It's not like they come in and all of a sudden they're like, you're a private, you're this, you're that. It's like they're others, and they're not protected the way a lot of the soldiers would have been, right?
Yeah, and so this is a little minor fact that a lot of people don't know, but it's an incredibly important one, which is that the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, which was, as I said, the first organization to stand up in the U.S. military for women, was at first the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And auxiliary was key here because it meant that they were actually civilians, and they had basically none of the protections that you would expect a sort of run-of-the-mill Army soldier to get. And this raised all sorts of issues, from the simple administrative stuff, like did they have to pay for their mail? Could they get free Bibles? What uniforms would they wear? Little stuff like that, to big things like, will they be protected, by the U.S. from litigation? Well, what happens if one of them dies overseas? And the forcing mechanism here is really that eventually, women in the Army are sent overseas, and it becomes much too complicated to even envision what would happen if they were sort of civilians, but also in the Army. They'd also been doing a terrific job. And so all of that coalesced, and eventually in 1943, they become the Women's Army Corps. But it is not an easy path. And it was one that, in fact, the head of the Women's Army Corps, Ovida Kalpabi, an incredible woman, warned of very early on and very repeatedly. And nobody listened to her until, many months into the experiment, when they realized that all the things she'd said were going to go wrong instantly went wrong. So it is pretty infuriating, actually. And I'll tell you this, just to make you a little more mad. At the end of the war, the same debate happens all over again about integrating women in 1948 into the U.S. Armed Forces more broadly. So clearly we did not learn our lesson, but they eventually arrived at the right conclusion.
The government not learning their lesson, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Both as government workers, we would see that on a day-to-day basis.
It only takes one try. That's how it's supposed to go. Efficiency.
The social aspect is very interesting, right? Because, of course, we look back, and anybody who would have served World War I, we say hero, we don't think twice about it. But if you're going back, and let's just take a whack as an example, she's out in New York City in her uniform. What kind of reactions is she going to get around this time?
So I think in many ways, women in uniform in World War II, I've started to see their reactions to them as a Rorschach test for who you are as a person. I think so many women were confronted with what you would hope, which is support and enthusiasm. And, their parents said, you go for it. Our son is serving and I'm going to hang 2 stars in my window and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. Obviously, if that didn't exist, they wouldn't have made their way across, over the bar and into the military. At the same time, there are segments of the population that just find this to be totally alien. The notion of women in uniform is like an affront to not only womanhood, but manhood. And the place that you see this the most, which is maybe not surprising to most people, but I found it sort of unnerving, is that in the debates in Congress over whether or not women should serve, it becomes this little fishbowl of the larger American Rorschach test, which is to say that you have congressmen loudly proclaiming what has become of American manhood, that we would let women do our fighting, these sort of absurd things in retrospect, but they felt very real at the time. It wasn't uniform, but it was certainly, I think you could see every view reflected in the American population. And that sustained itself throughout the war and wasn't helped by several scandals that sort of occurred about women's integrity and their propriety and things like that. But like the American Project more broadly, it reflected a great diversity of views. And these poor women just ended up being on the receiving end of it. And I should just add, I would be remiss if I didn't say that for women of color, this was walking around in their military uniforms, particularly at bases in the South, but not exclusively, was often made them a target of great disparagement. And they handled it with incredible integrity and incredible poise. But that was, for me, a really important part to convey in the book, and also an important part to acknowledge that it was in many ways, much more difficult for women of color who were wearing uniforms.
And it felt very much like, especially within the book, that the people who don't like this automatically assume that you're doing this because you're a harlot, because you're trying to get away from your family, you're trying to do all these terrible things. So, I mean, we've seen enough World War II movies where they have those dances and everything like that, where, of course, the gentlemen will do what the gentlemen do. But for the ladies, they had to be very strict about damn near everything just to kind of keep a lid. Like you said, there were still a few things that went wrong and a few scandals, but they had to really keep a tight lid on it.
Oh, yeah. And it was, in retrospect, it's kind of almost, if it weren't so appalling, it would be funny how ridiculous the restrictions were placed on these poor women who are just literally just trying to serve their country. Most of them are just going to church on Sunday for the most part. That's their big weekend activity. But look, I think within the segments of the population that were already inclined to distrust these organizations and the women who joined them, there was a real incentive to make mountains out of molehills. So in 1943, there's this pretty well-known scandal that I spent some time in the book, where a reporter essentially says these women are prostitutes. And he plays on a longstanding trope that, women in and around militaries are just there to be what was then called morale boosters. And it's devastating. These poor women who are in the military are heartbroken. It's devastating to recruiting, because now suddenly parents are saying, well, I'm not going to let my daughter do that. But it's, of course, totally untrue and based on nothing. The services, to their credit, understood the impossible standards that were being sort of imposed on their women, but they still had to respond to these sort of things. And so there were strict rules about drinking, strict rules about dating, strict rules about everything for these women, which were often very out of step with what was going on with the men. And in the book, there's a whole chapter on the fact that, there were these rules about, God forbid, a woman be caught with a beer out in public, whereas with the men, they were making accommodations for what were essentially like felonies, major crimes, and turning a blind eye to them. So it was a very different standard, and it was really hard to write about because it was so frustrating. But I do try and just lay it out for the reader as the reality of the time.
Now, we've already mentioned a couple of things, right? I think number one, Army nurse, right? Or military nurse. That's going to be something that we talked about, women being pilots. What other jobs were they being filtered into when they signed up for the military?
I'm so glad you asked. This is my favorite thing to talk about, because what I sort of alluded to it at the beginning, but I'll give you some specific examples. So essentially, women were not allowed to be in frontline forces. That doesn't happen until much, much later, in recent memory, in fact. So what it meant, though, is that they were often assigned to these support function, these underappreciated, what many people call combat support things. So this is the people who maintain planes. These are the people who lay cables. These are the people who type memos. And that doesn't sound very dynamic and cool, but you're a veteran, you probably know this yourself. Those are the people that make sure that the guys on the front line and now the women on the front line have exactly what they need, exactly when they need it, and they can do their jobs. And so if you cut out that whole segment of the military population, you don't have a military. And that's exactly where we find women. So some of my favorite examples are women like Susan Ahn, who was one of the first Korean American women to serve in the military. She trains men on how to use 50 cal machine guns. She trains men on how to fly planes. She is integral in the training enterprise and is a testament to the larger reality, which is that I think by the end of the war, almost every single Navy aviator was being trained by a woman at some point. It's women like Evelyn Zahn, who was a great artist. And so she's drawing maps to help men get through Normandy. They're not necessarily things that would jump out to you and say, oh, that won the war. But when you look at them together, they suddenly paint a picture of an essential function that, again, allows these frontline forces to do their jobs. And women are all over the place. You find them everywhere. And for me, that's what's so fun is I get to paint this picture of what's actually helping win the war, but through the perspective of the women who are doing it.
I know one of the most important things I learned in the military is wherever you go, whether it's civilian or military, you make friends with who's ever in charge of supply first.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the most important lessons you can learn, you get that free, nerds. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot, Lena.
Okay.
A lot of amazing women in here. Very interesting. But I'm going to tell you, you get your next book deal, and they say you can only write a biography about one woman from this book. Who are you going to choose?
That's impossible. That's like
you have to answer. Yeah, it's my podcast. You have to answer. You got to pick one.
Oh, man. All right. That's a tricky one. So my gut is telling me this, which is actually, I think, a little controversial, but also shows you how my mind works, which is I love women in uniform. I love women veterans. The woman that I'm going to choose, though, is actually not a veteran because she was disallowed from participating in the Navy, as the case may be. There's a woman called Margaret Chung. She gets basically zero credit, but in terms of setting up the Navy's program was as essential as someone like Congresswoman Edith North Rogers. She is a Chinese American woman who is also a doctor and is also incredibly cool. She drives a blue sports car. She's like in cosmetic surgery. She's mingling with all the famous people in California. And she happens to be friends with a bunch of naval aviators and submariners in around the late 1930s. And so when the legislation starts to come up for the WAVES, the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, she walks up to one of her former mentees, whose name I don't know if I can repeat because I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in the podcast, but you'll read it in the book. One of her mentees who all have this very specific name. And she says, let me join the Navy. And he says, there's legislation that needs to be passed before any woman can join the Navy. And she says, okay, I'll do it. Basically, I'll fix it. And she calls up all of her old friends, many of whom are in Congress or, friends with the president or whatever. And she basically almost single-handedly forces Congress and the Navy to pass this legislation. So she is a total dynamo. You'd expect that someone in that position would then instantly be, commissioned into the Navy, but is denied. Not once, not twice, I think, but 3 times. Once because of her age, because of her ethnicity, and because questions about her sexuality were at the time kind of swirling, and later her biographer proves to be true. It is, I think, in some ways a testament to so many good parts of this story about what women could do when she is committed to, women's progress and women being in the military, and also some of the most difficult underbelly of this story, which is how narrow our view of what women in uniform should have looked like at that time. So if you haven't read about Margaret Chung, you got to go Google her. She's the best.
Well, 2 things. If I had to pick who you were going to pick, it was going to be her, because I could tell you were dazzled by her from reading it.
I was so dazzled by her.
And I'm going to say this in like a very positive way. She also sounds super sketch. Just like she knows all these people, and you don't. And I remember reading there, I'm like, did I skip a page? Because something's going on here. I don't know what. Yeah. But I want to know because it sounds super cool.
I felt the same way. There's literally one biography of her out there as far as I can tell. So anybody wants to write that story, it's probably better screenplay than anything else. Please, maybe it'll be my next book.
You're probably not allowed to write the biography. The way it reads, it's kind of like she might still have somebody around who'll do something to you.
She may be still alive. Yeah.
Was there any one thing during your research that jumped out and shocked you more than anything else? Like you've said that there was a lot of stuff you didn't know, but was there anything that you're just like, how did I not know this? How is this not something everyone has heard about before?
I'm tempted to give a really serious answer to that because it is a serious topic. And there were many serious things that surprised me.
You can give me two answers, one funny and one serious. You go back.
All right, the serious answer is this. I'll give you the serious answer first, and then I'll tell you what my actual answer is. Serious answer is that, like I said, I walked in this thinking I had a really clear understanding of the 20th century women's movement. And I walked out of it thinking that not only I, but the larger population just fully misunderstands the role that the greatest generation plays in women's progress in the 20th century. They fill this huge gap between the suffragists and, the women's liberationists of the 60s and 70s, and they get no credit for this. So in addition to being trailblazers in the military, we've sort of forgotten them as trailblazers for women's progress in the United States. And that was both a surprise to me, it was like a broader sort of intellectual surprise, which I always find to be the most heartbreaking and motivating and interesting in some ways. So that's a kind of serious surprise of my research. The fun surprise is that there's so many funny stories that I got from these women. I mean, I laughed so much writing this book because it was like half of these women were in an Abbott and Costello sketch, like running around, trying to figure out how to rig a pulley so that they could get a tire up to the top rack of a warehouse, or Ovida Kulpabi trying to get her hat on straight during the first and most important commissioning ceremony in the United States in the women's program. They were so funny. They had the funniest stories, and it was so serious, obviously. And there's so much that I really tried to convey, but I just laughed. I laughed so much with these women, and I hope that comes across to readers on the page.
Now, I think this is the last question. I ask it of all authors. And honestly, I think we answered it already, but we got to do it again. All right. Lena, we know that there are poor, unfortunate souls out there. I feel terrible for them because they're missing these great stories, right? But they think history is a boring class I took in high school. Why would I read a history book? I grab one of those people, I sit them in front of you, and they say, why should I read Valiant Women? What are you going to say?
Well, first of all, I'm going to be so surprised that they think World War II is boring, because if they've watched any movie about World War II, it's the single most interesting conflict in American history, but I'm biased, so I'll put that aside. And what I'll say is this is the story of every American's family, right? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to someone and they said, you know what, now that you mention it, my great aunt was a part of the Waves, or my grandma was a part of the WAC, or my cousin's older sister had signed up to be in the nurse corps, or, one of my relatives was Rosie, or something like that. And to say that this is boring is essentially to say that the people in our lives, the people who did this, who are all affected by World War II, are boring. You have to take that up with your great aunt Rosie or whoever it is. But I think their stories are absolutely fascinating, and you should be interested in them because they're your story too. So I hope that people read this and they remember that one older lady who they never asked enough questions of, but who was really, really interesting. My guess is she did something pretty cool in 1942.
Well, Lena, I loved it. Everybody should read it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It was an absolute delight.
And that's it for this episode. Lena, thank you so much for coming on. Valiant Women, great book. Go out and buy it, folks. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Got all sorts of awesome history stuff on all of those. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Leave us comments. You can subscribe to us on Buzzsprout or even make a donation on the actual blog. Please, we need it. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.